miles. Turn right to merge onto I-40 East toward US 79 North.
Arkansas, the natural state. I'm Trey Kay here with my colleague Loretta Williams, and we've returned to follow up on a story about farmers, soybeans, and an herbicide that's pitted farmer against farmer.
Soybeans to the right of us, soybeans to the left of us, soybeans in front of us.
Yeah. Farmers here in Arkansas continue to argue over the use of a weed killer called Dicamba. Over the past couple of years, those arguments have gotten ugly for those who say the product causes problems.
For the past 7 years, the use of dicamba over the top in crops has been a controversial issue. It is so controversial that many farmers, backyard gardeners, and homeowners are fearful to express their views or submit a complaint, according to the National Wildlife Federation report.
On the other side of the debate, pro-dicamba farmers have taken their case to court. They've challenged who gets to make the decisions about dicamba's use in Arkansas.
These past several years have thrown into sharp relief the lack of judgment that characterizes the plant board and the astounding absence of wisdom and prudence from their councils.
Usually, when we explore us and them dynamics on this show, the divides break along familiar lines: race, class, politics, religion, or sexual orientation. But in Arkansas, many of the farmers at odds over a weed killer wear the same brand of work clothes, worship together, or even vote for the same candidates. Dicamba has created a brand new divide. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us. I'm Trey Kay. My colleague Loretta Williams and I have been looking at this story about dicamba for several years.
We're focused on Arkansas because back in 2018, the state had the tightest restrictions around the use of a new version of dicamba. Farmers had to stop using it for the season after April 15th, and that made some farmers angry.
Wait, Loretta, before we go any further, let's remind listeners, what is dicamba?
So dicamba is a weed killer that's been around in various forms for decades. Row crop farmers typically use it to get rid of weeds in the early spring before plants start to grow above ground. These new versions are for what's called in-crop use. In other words, it's used once plants are growing above ground.
And you use the phrase row crop farmers. They are farm crops like soybeans, corn, cotton, right?
Yes, corn, cotton, soybeans are just some of the crops that are genetically modified so farmers can use chemical herbicides during the growing phase of the plants. So think of it as a two-part system. One part is the genetically modified seed, the other part is the matching herbicide.
So how does that actually work in the field?
Well, for example, for years, soybean farmers planted Roundup-ready soybean seeds. And those are genetically modified so farmers can spray Roundup, also known as glyphosate, to kill weeds without killing their soybean crop.
And as I understand, there's several lawsuits about the alleged health effects of Roundup. But that's not the story we're focusing on. For farmers, the big issue is a noxious weed called pigweed that Roundup used to effectively hold at bay. But it doesn't kill pigweed very well anymore.
So a few years ago, chemical companies such as BASF and Monsanto, before it was owned by the German chemical company Bayer, they started looking around for a replacement for Roundup, and they landed on a new version or formulation, as they call it, of dicamba. Here's how Monsanto was selling that product in 2018.
These are soybean plants. Without a weed management program, weeds will compete directly for water, light, and nutrients.
Monsanto called their new dicamba XtendiMax, BASF called their product Engenia, and there are a couple of other versions marketed by other chemical companies as well.
The addition of dicamba tolerance in the creation of the Roundup Ready to Extend trait provides soybeans the ability to stand strong against both glyphosate and dicamba herbicide formulations approved for in-crop use.
But as we've reported before, some say there's an issue with these new formulations of dicamba that just won't go away.
Farmers, weed scientists, and others have told us these new versions of dicamba don't always stay where they are sprayed.
It gets up and walks, if you will, a lot.
That's Charles Sloan, or Bo Sloan as he likes to be called. He's the manager of the Dale Bumpers White River Wildlife Refuge in Arkansas. When Sloan says it gets up and walks, he's talking about the weed killer's tendency to move around in hot weather. When the temperature gets above 85 degrees or so, dicamba can volatilize. Volatilize is just a fancy scientific word for saying that it can change from a liquid to a gas.
And we're, known for hot and humid weather, and this stuff volatilizes at much, much lower temperatures than what we typically get those times of year.
So these new versions were supposed to take care of this tendency of dicamba to turn into a gas under hot, humid, and other conditions. The chemical is supposed to stay put. But for the past 5 years, there's been a lot of talk about how these new dicambas can float around and hit other crops like sweet potatoes, peanuts, and tomatoes. When that happens, scientists say dicamba can damage and even kill other plants, including other soybean crops that are not genetically modified for this particular herbicide.
Arkansas Row Crops Radio, providing up-to-date information and timely recommendations on row crop production in Arkansas.
Here's one of the best places to hear what's going on about this problem.
Hello and welcome to the Weeds Are Wild podcast series as part of Arkansas Row Crops Radio.
This is University of Arkansas weed scientist Tom Barber hosting an episode in July 2021.
So 2 weeks ago, my counterpart and extension weed specialist, Dr. Tommy Butts, reported over 200,000 acres that had been injured by dicamba off-target movement. However, over the last 2 weeks, that number has increased exponentially, unfortunately. And we believe at this time there's more than 650,000 acres affected in Arkansas. And that's, again...
Wait a minute. Did we just hear him say that in the summer of 2021, these new formulations of dicamba may have damaged 650,000 acres of soybeans? That's a lot of acres.
It's more than 1,000 square miles spread over mostly the eastern part of the state.
So if I compare that 650,000 to the total number of soybeans planted in Arkansas in 2020, that would mean that at least a third of all the soybean acres in the state may have had dicamba damage last year. That must have made a lot of soybean farmers upset.
Yes, and that's at the heart of this tug of war over the herbicide.
But chemical trespass, as some call it, it isn't new.
No. Typically, when a farmer sprays a chemical and it accidentally drifts onto and hurts another farmer's crop, there's a way for the affected farmer to recover some of his loss. The farmer who did the spraying often has insurance that would cover these sorts of accidents, which, after an investigation by the insurance company, can compensate the affected farmer for his crop loss. Think of it as the agricultural equivalent of a fender bender.
And what happens with dicamba is different?
Yes. When a farmer sees symptoms of possible dicamba damage to his crop, he's in a bind. That farmer may not know where the dicamba came from. It could be the farmer next door that's using the herbicide, or as many scientists have pointed out, it could come from a farm a mile away. So there's an accident, but we don't see who's caused it. And most of this comes down to that question of volatility, which has been a big part of this debate for the last few years.
We heard from Terry Fuller at the top of the show. He's a farmer from Poplar Grove, Arkansas. He's spent the last several years talking about the damage this herbicide can cause. Fuller referred to a National Wildlife Federation report when he talked to members of the Arkansas legislature.
Their research found that damage from this highly mobile herbicide does not stop at the field edge. Dicamba is highly volatile. easily evaporating from plant and soil surfaces, and can continue to volatilize for days after application.
A little background on Terry Fuller. He and his twin brother run Fuller Seed and Supply. They own some commercial real estate, they raise cattle, corn, and soybeans. Most importantly, starting in 2013, Terry Fuller became a member of the Arkansas State Plant Board. In fact, he was the chairman for a couple of years. The plant board makes decisions about the rules farmers need to know and follow regarding agriculture in the state of Arkansas.
So the Arkansas Plant Board is more than 100 years old, and board members like Fuller are volunteers. Until recently, some were appointed by the governor, and others were chosen by various farm groups. Terry Fuller, for example, was selected by the Seed Growers Association. Fuller used to think the board worked pretty smoothly, and that most people respected the decisions of the plant board. But as the dicamba debate heated up, Terry Fuller started having problems he'd rarely had before.
On our visit to Arkansas, he drove us to see some of those problems that seemed to coincide with his public statements about dicamba. We've driven out to the St. Francis levee, where Fuller says he and his brother have an agreement to clear the grass around the levee, which they bale as hay for their cattle and horses.
A year and a half ago in July, when I testified at the Joint Legislative Committee, I testified 2 o'clock. The next morning, daylight's when our tractors wouldn't run.
The Fullers keep 2 tractors parked here on the levee, about 7 miles apart. Fuller says after his testimony, someone poured plastic bits in both of the tractor's motors, which caused more than $60,000 worth of damage.
The next month, I testified again to the same committee. Before I got out of town, I had this 367 bales of hay right here on fire. You know, we've had at least 5 hay fires in the last year and a half.
When the plant board considered dicamba regulations, Terry Fuller consistently voted to limit the window for its use. That's because of the damage he says it's done to Arkansas farms and plant life. But as we drove back to town, he says he didn't always feel that way.
When I first came to know about dicamba spraying, I was in the seed business, so I was every summer normally we have tours of the products, and the salesmen come by visiting, and the dicamba product, they showed us how it stayed in the field. They didn't have issues. They set the trial up right on the south side of a neighborhood around Marion, Arkansas, where they could see what it did to the neighborhood. And I was so excited when I got on the plant board that I was going to be part of bringing this technology forward to the farmers in Arkansas to be able to use.
So you were hopeful about dicamba in the beginning?
No, I was an advocate. I was way more than hopeful. In the first plant board meeting I went to, and I can't remember the guy's name from Mississippi State, came and presented, and they talked about all the potential problems, and it's kind of like just the air went out of my balloon, and I'm like, oh man, I hadn't thought about all this. Well, surely this is not true. Then every meeting, everything that went, it just kept going downhill from there.
That Mississippi State guy was weed scientist Dan Reynolds. In 2013, he warned Arkansas Plant Board members about the damage weed killers like dicamba could do to many crops. He wasn't the only weed scientist who raised red flags. Scientists from across farming communities in Pennsylvania, Missouri, Tennessee, and Arkansas told their state agencies, the chemical companies, and the EPA that the new formulations of dicamba might damage many plants not modified to withstand the weed killer.
Despite the warnings, the EPA approved the new dicamba products, and chemical companies sold the herbicide for the 2017 growing season. That summer, the Arkansas State Plant Board received roughly 1,000 complaints about crops and gardens with curled leaves and dead or drooping plants.
And that's what led the Arkansas Plant Board to put the brakes on dicamba use in 2018. It set April 15th as a cutoff date for spraying the weed killer in the state for that season.
So, Loretta, I want to point out that initially the plant board followed the recommendations of scientists. But some say those recommendations have taken a back seat in the last few years. We've seen the plant board vote to push the cutoff date forward into the late spring and summer so that farmers can use it longer into the growing season.
So we had to ask, if farmers can spray dicamba through June or July, and farmers and scientists report it can damage hundreds of thousands of acres of crops, why aren't more farmers speaking up now?
The answer to that question is complicated. But if Terry Fuller's experience is any indication, people are worried about becoming a target for retaliation. We stopped by Fuller's office so that he could show us an example.
Fuller pulls out 3 very large signs that have been posted along the local highway near his farm in Poplar Grove.
All I want for Christmas is a new plant board. Arkansas pigweed population sponsored by Terry Fuller and the Arkansas Plant Board.
If you didn't hear that, Arkansas pigweed population is sponsored by Terry Fuller and the Arkansas Plant Board.
So these are, you're right, professionally printed ones, right? It's kind of like they went to Kinko's or, a printing place.
Oh, yeah.
Got this done.
In addition to the tractor damage and the hay burning, signs like this have been repeatedly put up near Fuller's house, including one that could be seen from his daughter's bedroom window on Christmas Day. Others he took down after he got a call from a neighbor who saw them attached to roadsides along major thoroughfares.
We don't know of other farmers who have been harassed quite like Fuller, but fewer people felt comfortable talking to us, citing fears of possible retaliation. One farmer, who turned in a complaint about possible dicamba damage to his crops, retracted the complaint a week later. A plant board inspector noted in his report that the farmer did that because he said he'd been threatened.
So we started to ask, what's going on here? These rural farm communities are typically tight-knit. And if one farmer has a problem with another, they meet at what's called the turn row to talk things out. But that's not happening. So what's fueling the tension between Arkansas farmers?
There are 2 parts to this dynamic. One might say the personal and the political.
So let's start with the political. Back in 2018, I heard Franklin Fogelman, who farms in northeast Arkansas, speak at a plant board meeting. He wanted a longer season to use dicamba on his soybeans to spray his crops into May.
And as I was preparing for what I was going to say today, I heard a song play across Pandora in my office one day. It's a fantastic blues song. Everybody should listen to it. It says, "If trouble was money, I'd be a millionaire by now." I'm not here for trouble. What I'm here is for your ear and for your consideration to gracefully go and take under consideration something that a large portion of Arkansas farmers need, and that's to be able to use dicamba next year.
Fogelman and other pro-dicamba farmers didn't like the April 15th cutoff and decided to take their dicamba crusade into court and into the political arena.
From documents filed with the IRS and the Arkansas Secretary of State, we learned that Franklin Fogelman is treasurer of a group called Farm Voice. There's both a nonprofit and a Farm Voice political action committee. Farm Voice seems to have gotten started in 2018 after the Arkansas Plant Board voted to restrict the use of dicamba for that growing season.
Their IRS form says they were created, and I quote, "to represent and promote broad-based agricultural interests and increase economic opportunity within the state of Arkansas and surrounding region, both now and for the future." There's a bit more about their statement, which talks about information sharing and building relationships and alliances, but it didn't tell us anything about their stand on dicamba. We tried to talk to Franklin Fogelman or anyone from Farm Voice to learn about their position on the herbicide. We sent emails, made phone calls. We even knocked on the door of the Fogelman firm in Marion, Arkansas. And this very nice woman came out to greet us.
Hi, can I help you?
Hi, we're actually looking for Franklin Fogelman.
Oh, he farms.
Right.
Are you looking for some of his rental property, maybe?
Well, no, not exactly. We had an exchange with him in email earlier today, and he wasn't clear. Oh, I'm sorry. We should say we're journalists, and this is Trey, and I'm Loretta.
That's fine.
But we had an exchange with him earlier today in email, and we were just on our way into Memphis, and we thought, oh, we'll stop by.
Oh, yeah. He farms. You will hardly ever catch him here unless he just stops
That
in.
nice woman gave us a card, and we did try calling him, but didn't get a response. In an email, Fogelman declined our interview request, as did someone else we've talked with before, Michael McCarty. He's listed as president of the Farm Voice Political Action Committee. None of the other Farm Voice members responded to us or were willing to talk about their group.
We know from earlier interviews and posts we've seen on Facebook and Twitter that Farm Voice members wanted the plant board to drop any restrictions on the use of this new dicamba. And I'm going to use a little bit of farmer jargon here, Trey.
Oh, God, I hate jargon.
Other than the federal label. And here's what's important to know about what that means. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which approves the use of pesticides in the United States, literally requires a label on every bottle, jug, drum, what have you, saying how and when a pesticide can be used. The label is the law.
And for this new version of dicamba, the federal label says it can be used up until June 30th for soybeans and July 30th for cotton, right?
Yes, I mean, the federal label is many pages long and includes a bunch of other restrictions. And some states also added their own restrictions on top of what the federal label requires. So, for example, in Illinois, and as of this year, in parts of Iowa and Minnesota, farmers can't spray dicamba once the temperature hits 85 degrees.
Right, or like in Arkansas's case, the state originally decided to halt the use of dicamba after April 15th each year to try to protect crops that aren't dicamba tolerant. So Farm Voice appears to be comprised of some of the bigger farmers in the state. And I remember what a farmer once told me, that most of us outside of agriculture don't realize that farming is a big business. A big business.
The USDA lists soybean farming as a $1.5 billion business in Arkansas.
So if I get out my calculator, and if a farmer grows a couple of thousand acres of soybeans and is able to harvest the USDA's estimate of 50 bushels an acre, that's valued at $10 a bushel. Well, that's $1 million right there.
And some farmers in Arkansas grow more than that. I've seen numbers as high as 8,000 acres of soybeans for one farmer in a single year. And by comparison, there are many farmers who grow far less than 1,000 acres of soybeans. And there are many more small farms than big farms.
So in Arkansas, the battle over these dates for dicamba use played out in meetings at the state plant board over and over again. It was a real us and them scene. And as of 2021, the Farm Voice farmers, those guys with some of the larger farms, they got what they wanted. Now, dicamba use in Arkansas matches the federal label and can be sprayed until the end of June for soybeans and the end of July for cotton.
But Farm Voice didn't stop there. They were also unhappy with the folks that make the rules, the Arkansas State Plant Board. Here's Perry Galloway, the president of Farm Voice, at a state legislature meeting in August 2020.
Many of these board seats are obsolete, antiquated, and out of touch with Arkansas agriculture. The board is making rules that affect thousands of Arkansas farmers, raising billions of dollars worth of commodities, and yet some don't know the difference between a whippoorwill pea and a pawpaw. Personal agendas come before unbiased decisions for Arkansas's farmers. Biased private industry is making the rules, enforcing the rules, and delivering penalty. Under this current structure, the Arkansas State Plant Board is acting as judge, jury, and executioner.
And this is where things start to get a little personal. When Perry Galloway and Charles Williams, another Farm Voice member, testified to the legislature, they took issue with Terry Fuller, who was chairman of the state plant board at the time. Here's Charles Williams.
On information and belief, Board Chairman Terry Fuller has demonstrated a pattern of behavior consistent with undue influence on plant board process. It appears he has gone beyond the course and scope of his official duties. I'm willing to give several examples, but the most disturbing is the role Mr. Fuller has personally taken in policing pesticide use.
Loretta, I have to say, political action committees and taking aim at plant board members don't seem like talk it out at the turn row kind of moves.
Well, no. But it's important to understand that Farm Voice is well within its rights to file lawsuits or use a political action committee to donate to legislators or to the governor. And to be fair, there is also a group called Freedom to Farm, composed of farmers who believe the in-crop use of dicamba is harmful to their businesses. They too rallied farmers to voice their opinions to the plant board when a vote regarding dicamba was on the agenda.
One other farmer willing to give us his perspective is Reed Story. He farms not far from Terry Fuller. We headed over to his house one evening during a rainstorm.
I didn't know it had started raining. We got into your carport just right in the nick of time.
And several of Reed Story's dogs and cats came to check out the visitors. What's your dog's name?
Gus?
Gus. Hi, Gus. We headed inside and dried off, and then we settled in around his dining room table to talk.
You know my show, it's us and them. And the way I've seen things develop, at this point now, there seems to be kind of a larger, more powerful us who seems to be marginalizing a smaller them. You're nodding your head, yes. Is that the way you're seeing the situation?
You know, I look at it as big agriculture against smaller ag people or smaller growers, but the growers that do want to use the dicamba technology, they do make it look as if the people not wanting the dicamba technology are in the wrong.
I guess what I want to ask is sometimes farmers are reluctant to make a complaint to the plant board if they feel like they have symptoms of dicamba on their crops.
And I would agree to that to some extent. I mean, just say the plant board comes out and they see you have damage, yet they go over into a neighbor's field and see that they've applied it. The automatic thought would be, well, it came from this neighbor. Of course, if records show that it didn't, just the image of the plant board being in a neighbor's field makes your neighbor feel and other people look at your neighbor as they've done something wrong, which is not necessarily the case. Especially because when you're living in a small community, I mean, you know everybody essentially. So, you know, if it's a neighbor you've always gotten along with, never had any issues with, you really feel like they have done everything in their power, you don't want to see them, you know, get in trouble. Yeah.
So Trey, what Reed Story had to say surprised me a little bit at first, but I think I get it. The EPA has approved this herbicide. The plant board now says it's okay to spray up until June 30th on soybeans, so a farmer may feel like he has the right to use it. And here's the key thing: not get blamed for any damage that may happen as a result.
Reed Story says blame the product, not the farmer. But I want to get into something else that he told us, because this effort to get along seems to be a little one-sided to me. Story says he used to post his thoughts about dicamba on social media, but admitted he's pulled back in the last couple of years.
Originally, when this all started, I was pretty public on social media about it. In the last 2 or 3 years, I have not been as vocal.
Why?
Ridiculed. I mean, you will publicly be ridiculed if you start speaking against it.
Can you just tell me a little more about the ridicule and how does it affect you?
Well, Personally, it doesn't affect me. I have pretty thick skin, but I'm sure you're aware there's been a former plant board member that has had extensive vandalism to his hay and farm equipment, and the vandalism being pretty close to home to my operation, I didn't want that being my equipment. Didn't want that being my crop. So quiet down a little bit, still speak the truth when there are meetings, but social media is just, you're not going to win an argument on social media.
The pressure around this conversation is also happening in other arenas. Some Farm Voice members have kicked the conversation into the courts.
They took issue with the way the plant board members are chosen and filed a lawsuit to change that. Monsanto filed a similar lawsuit.
What's important to know is that up until 2021, half of the 18 members on the board were chosen by various private industry groups. That included people like Terry Fuller, who was appointed by the Seed Growers Association. The rest were appointed by the governor of Arkansas.
We won't go into the legal messiness of it all, except to say that the lawsuits were successful, and members like Terry Fuller, who were appointed by farm industry groups, were removed from the plant board. The governor and state legislators now determine who serves on the plant board. And here's something else to think about. Most people outside of agriculture don't know about this debate, yet all these decisions, they affect far more than farmers and crops.
When I first started seeing issues with my bees, I was unsure what was going on. I'd never seen this before.
After a break, we'll hear how this guy says Dicamba ran him out of the state of Arkansas. You're listening to Us and Them. Our show is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, this is Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. And today, an update on a story that we've been following for a few years. It's about the use of a weed-killing chemical that's caused division in Arkansas and farming communities across the middle of the country. The herbicide is called Dicamba, and according to many farmers and scientists, it doesn't always stay where it's sprayed. Other Arkansas citizens have started to pay attention, and some say the signs of possible damage are showing up in unintended places, sometimes in places meant to preserve nature. In the fall of 2021, my colleague Loretta Williams and I drove to St. Charles, Arkansas, to meet up with Bo Sloan, the project manager for the Dale Bumpers White River National Wildlife Refuge.
Sloan met us in the parking lot of the visitor center, and we immediately started talking about the trees.
Like these trees here were, this tree showed a little bit of see how that cupping?
Yeah. We're standing in front of an oak tree where the leaves are curled inward a bit. Sloan says it's a sign that floating dicamba may have damaged this and other trees at the refuge.
The sycamore trees show it really well.
Yeah.
It's that symptomology just really, it'll take that leaf and just turn it, upside down.
Yeah, and they're usually like flat and they have almost like a big hand.
Exactly,
right?
That's right. But when they've been exposed like that, they just get that real cereal bowl effect to it, and you can see it just driving down a gravel road, just it jumps right out at you. And then when you start looking...
You wouldn't think that dicamba would be an issue here. The trees are thick and just starting to turn color in early October. But if dicamba gets up and walks, it often touches down somewhere. Sloan walks us into the visitor center and leads us to a large map on a wall.
This area here This is the Dale Bumpers White River National Wildlife Refuge, and everything up this way.
The map shows a 55-mile-long ribbon of deep green. At its widest spot, the refuge is 10 to 12 miles across. The flatlands of the delta hug the east side of the White River. Sloan points to another flat spot on the west side.
Right over in here, which is where we are currently, this is called the Grand Prairie. And although it looks really similar, it's not. You know, it's completely different soils. It was formed differently, that sort of thing.
And on this map, it looks like, I mean, you can even tell, the thing that makes it look like a quilt is agriculture.
That's right.
You're saying that this is farmland, right?
Yeah,
right,
this is
right,
all
right.
farmland.
All that's farmland. All of this, everything that you see, that this little patchwork of green squares, light green, dark green, you know, all of those are agricultural fields.
The refuge is surrounded, north, south, east, and west, by those farm fields. Sloan didn't know much about the Dicamba debate until he got a call in the summer of 2021 from some University of Arkansas extension scientists. They'd been out looking at possible Dicamba damage on farms in the area.
And they asked if I minded if they came to the refuge and looked, because they were getting a tremendous amount of complaints from farmers whose soybeans were being affected. And so I said, well, absolutely. I'd love to have you guys come and you can show me what it looks like if we have it. And went and rode a large amount of the refuge, but you're not going to hardly cover this refuge in one day. And lo and behold, it seemed like everywhere we went, we saw it.
Sloan saw the cupped leaves and exhausted droop, typical of a plant that has been damaged by dicamba exposure. University of Arkansas scientist Victor Ford was along for the ride. He specializes in the impact of herbicides on trees and sent Sloan a follow-up letter.
Number one, there were tree, shrubs, and understory plants damaged in all the areas we visited. The damage was slight, and all plants are expected to recover. The damage appeared to be in clumps. The higher elevations showed more damage than the lower elevations.
Loretta, as Bo Sloan was reading that letter, I thought, is that good news or bad news? They saw some damage that may be related to dicamba, but not dead plants or trees.
Well, scientists are still learning about the long-term impact of dicamba on trees and shrubs. The issue is something called sublethal doses. In other words, how many years can a tree withstand the effects of small amounts of dicamba before it really hurts a tree? And obviously, trees are everywhere. Bo Sloan was worried enough about the damage that he saw that he filed a complaint with the plant board a few weeks after his visit with the scientists.
Because it's affecting the stuff in our yard, in the lands that we hunt on, that we recreate on, be it public or private. Dicamba doesn't care, but when the conditions are right, it's coming, and it leaves its mark, and just like the letter said, is anything going to die this year? Nope, probably not. Do I think this is the first year that we've had this damage? Absolutely, it is not. Because now that I know what it looks like, I'm like, wow, we've been seeing this now for several years. So at what point does it get to where there is some mortality of trees associated with it?
And if dicamba can hurt trees, it may also hurt other things.
So this is another one of our pieces of property where we unload bees. There's really nothing to see about a beehive unless you put a bee suit on and open the lid.
We'll skip that part.
Okay.
So that's Richard Coy of Coy's Honey Farm. And I have to say, Loretta, I'm a little disappointed that you didn't get out there with those bees.
Well, Richard Coy had already pulled a bee out of my hair earlier, so I was good with staying in the truck.
The Coy's honey business shows a different side to the possible effects of dicamba. Richard's dad, Bobby Coy, started the family bee business back in the 1960s. Over the years, Richard Coy and his brother David helped their dad turn Coy's Honey Farm into the largest commercial bee business in Arkansas. But in 2019, at a plant board meeting, we heard Richard Coy say this.
My family has made the decision to relocate our business to other states because it is not profitable to keep bees on a commercial scale in this state anymore. This decision is not a political stunt, as many have accused me. This is about my survival. Have any of you had to tell your wife and little girl that you have to move to another state because people don't do the right thing?
Loretta, you went to visit with Richard Coy to see how his business is doing and to talk with him about the events that led up to his move.
So let's back up a few years. The Coys used to have 13,000 hives concentrated across the northeastern part of Arkansas. Then came 2017. That's when many farmers first started using the new formulation of Dicamba.
When I first started seeing issues with my bees, I was unsure what was going on. It was just, I'd never seen this before.
Coy says you can tell the health of a hive by how much honey it makes. And in the early summer of 2017, his employees noticed that some of his bees weren't making much honey. Coy went looking and noticed a problem with a native plant called red vine.
We always had bees in areas where when that bloomed, the bees were making honey. And it wasn't blooming. Or if it was blooming, there were very few blooms on it. And so I was like, something's going on. Well, I was hearing rumors about so-and-so has curled leaves on his soybeans, Dicamba, and I was telling my wife, Julie, what was going on, and she said, well, let's just look something up. And so she looked up Dicamba and pollinators.
They found a study from a Penn State University researcher on the effects of Dicamba on pollinator habitat.
And they found that pollinator habitat, the flowering process would be reduced by 50%, and there would be 50% less visits. It didn't take a beekeeper very long to figure out if my plants aren't blooming, I'm not making very much honey.
Coy called the plant board and they sent out a couple of inspectors, including a bee inspector. They too noticed that there was visible damage to the local plants and there wasn't much in the way of pollen for the bees. Then they traveled 30 miles south to where Coy had some bees near a soybean field that had planted different seeds.
So there was no Dicamba being sprayed in that area. There was no symptomology on the soybeans. My beehives had over 100 pounds of honey per hive. The bee yard we had just left had about 40 pounds per hive. And then there were multiple frames of pollen in those beehives at that second location. And so I knew what was going on.
Coy talked about his problem at plant board meetings. He traveled to Washington, D.C. to talk to the EPA, but his bee populations continued to plummet.
Loretta, aren't there a lot of other things that have been doing bees in for a while now?
Yes, and beekeepers like Coy, well, they're used to a cycle where their bee populations go up and down throughout the year. Richard Coy said he always expected a 30 to 40% loss to his hives each year, but this was new.
Let me just say this. Now in our business, everything is pre-Dicamba or after Dicamba.
Before 2017, the Coys would bring their bees from Arkansas down to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi each winter, where it was warmer and plants bloomed earlier, and the bees would bounce back from that 30 to 40% loss. So at first, Richard Coy thought he could adapt to the Dicamba situation.
I believe we were down to 6,000 hives in the winter of 18. And we brought our bees down here to Mississippi, and we were able to get our numbers back up. And we moved to new locations in Arkansas.
But in the spring and summer of 2018, more Arkansas farmers were growing the new Dicamba-tolerant soybeans, and that meant more Dicamba weed killer was being sprayed.
And so I couldn't get away from it. And by February of 2019, we were down to 4,000 hives. And, that was just it. I mean, we could not take bees back to Arkansas. Down to 4,000 hives, it's going to be a struggle just to get back up to stay in business.
And that was the same month we heard Coy make his statement at the plant board meeting about moving.
Yes, the entire Coy family decided they had to get out of Arkansas, and so everybody moved to Mississippi, which is where I went to see them in their new operation. Richard Coy estimates his financial hit at about $7.5 million and growing. Bobby Coy says they now have to work twice as hard for less money.
Not to mention they had to leave their homes and friends behind.
Yeah, and Richard Coy says he feels for all those other Arkansas farmers who can't move and who are trying to grow a crop other than dicamba-tolerant soybeans or cotton.
I've told other people, I've never told this to a reporter, but it reminds me of the bullies in school. There have been people tell me, you need to watch your back, you probably need to, it's time to just be quiet, and you're going to survive, your business is going to survive, and just go on. And I've told them, I was bullied my whole life through school. I'm not afraid of the bullies now. And if we don't stand up for what is the right thing to be done, then no one does. My wife is ready for me to be quiet about it, and I rest better when I can just forget about it, but it's changed my whole life.
Richard Coy is now a plaintiff in a civil lawsuit against Bayer, the company that now owns Monsanto, and BASF. The lawsuit alleges, among other claims, that the companies misrepresented the nature of their dicamba products.
Coy's lawsuit against Bayer isn't the first. A peach farmer in Missouri won a court case against Bayer and BASF in 2019 over damage he claims the new dicamba did to his orchards. Bayer and BASF are appealing that verdict.
And a group of Texas farmers have sued the companies in Texas state court for the damage they say dicamba has done to their vineyards.
And there's a class action litigation against Bayer and BASF that combines the cases of several farmers across 8 states. In 2020, a multi-million-dollar settlement was reached between Bayer and multiple soybean farmers who alleged dicamba damage to their crops between 2015 and 2020. Other litigation remains ongoing.
In an email, Bayer says the company stands fully behind their XtendiMax herbicide and Xtend system. They also say that based on their data, they believe the vast majority of XtendiMax customers had success with weed control and on-target applications in 2021.
And in another email, BASF says it encourages all applicators to speak with their neighbors before the growing season to understand what they are planning to plant, and to check if they are growing sensitive crops, and to follow the label directions.
Trey, obviously there's a lot of money at stake on both sides of this debate. But remember Bo Sloan?
I do. He's the Arkansas Wildlife Refuge Manager.
Right, and he says there's a lot more to this than money.
This is a much, much bigger conversation than just farm to farm. This is farm to basically all land use types. If you're in the lower Mississippi River Valley, it affects you. It affects you. You don't have to farm. Just be there, literally, or care about something there. Maybe it's public land. Maybe you don't live there. Maybe you live in Timbuktu somewhere, but you like to know that state wildlife management area is there, or that national wildlife refuge is there, and maybe you're in California, but you like to know that some of these bottomland hardwoods in the state of Arkansas exist to help protect, preserve some of our natural resources, be it plant or wildlife, and maybe you'll never come and hunt or fish them or walk through them, but you like to know they're there.
So, Loretta, we focused on Arkansas as an example of what people have had to wrestle with over the past 5 years with this herbicide. Let's wrap up by talking about where all this is going.
Well, it might come down to the lawsuits. They're the ones we mentioned against Bayer and BASF, and the Center for Food Safety and other environmental groups have also filed against the EPA for approving the use of these new versions of dicamba.
And as I understand it, the EPA in the Biden administration has taken another look at their approval process.
Yes, in fact, the agency recently admitted it did not meet its own standard for scientific integrity when the agency reapproved the label again in 2018. The EPA also put out a document detailing what the agency has learned about the damage dicamba has caused. But So far, they've stopped short of taking the herbicide off the market. And one guess is that they're just letting the current lawsuits settle the issue.
And then there's an even bigger issue for farmers neither of us considered. Farmer Reed Story raised this when you asked him a question about the future.
Right. I wanted to know, if nothing changed, if this herbicide is here to stay and that's just the way it's going to be, how did that sit with him?
It doesn't sit well at all because, again, this is not just about farmers. And farmers are pushing for this technology. That's putting another negative image on farmers, and we're asking the general public to trust us about providing a sustainable, safe food and fiber for them to utilize. But yet the farmers wanting this technology and using this technology are causing all farmers to look like we don't care. And I care.
You know, it gives me hope to hear Reed Story say that he cares. And I suspect that many other farmers do as well. Although I do wonder how long it will take for farmers in Arkansas to trust each other again, or if they ever will. And I don't know. I mean, for me, that's the saddest part of this story. The split in the community may never heal. Loretta, I want to thank you so much for keeping an eye on this very interesting us and them story in Arkansas.
Well, thanks, Trey, for also being along for this story. Thank you.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Loretta Williams, Mitch Hanley, and Kate Smith. Thanks to Ian Carble of Mountain State Spotlight and IdeaStream Media in Cleveland, Ohio. Special thanks to Jen Nelson of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Michael Lipton and Tristam Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and the CRC Foundation. This episode is supported with a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.